The Pepsodent Show, starring Bob Hope.
May 1941, 7 months before the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. The producer of the Bob Hope radio show suggested that he take the program out of its Hollywood studio to broadcast one show from the airbase at March Field. At first, Bob had no interest in dragging the entire cast, crew, and equipment on a 59-mile road trip. But the idea of performing in front of entertainment-starved servicemen proved irresistible.
Well, here we are, ladies and gentlemen, at March Field, one of the Army's great flying fields located near Riverside, California. And what a wonderful welcome they gave me. As soon as I got in the camp, I received a 10-gun salute. They told me on the operating table.
Response from the men was electric, and Bob realized that he'd been wrong about hitting the road to entertain troops. I was resisting an idea that was to change my whole life, he wrote later. We had no idea we were going to discover an audience so ready for laughter.
From somewhere in North Africa.
In a theater somewhere in England.
From somewhere in the South Pacific.
From the home front to the fighting fronts, the #1 comedian of the armed forces, Bob Hope.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Bob broadcasting from an Ordnance Supply Base, Hope. This is Bob, Mosquito Network, Hope. Yes, sir, this is Bob, Army Camp, Hope. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bob. Don't ask me where I am because I don't know, and even if I did know, I couldn't tell because it's a military secret, Hope.
Flushed with excitement by the March Field experience, Bob Hope decided to broadcast his weekly radio show from military bases across the country and around the world for the duration of what would be a difficult, painful, and costly war. Bob's patriotic dedication inspired other stars to become involved in the war effort. Entertainment played a vital role in helping Americans on the battlefront and the home front sustain the drive and will to fight.
Thank you. How are you, fellow tourists? How are you?
Bob Hope changed the rules of comedy during World War II. Certainly, he wanted to be funny, but he also had to keep in mind the daily death and destruction enveloping the troops. He chose to assume the viewpoint of the average soldier, battling not just the Germans and the Japanese, but also boredom and mud and loneliness and fear.
And I'll never forget the plane trip across the Atlantic. What thrills. You can take my pilot's word for it. I wasn't nervous, but I was shaking so hard the pilot cut out both motors and my knees kept the plane in the air.
Hi there, I'm Kim Geis, Senior Curator here at the National WWII Museum, and I am delighted to be joined here today by Linda Hope, daughter of entertainer and legend Bob Hope. So you just had an opportunity to see Bob, to learn a little bit about Bob in that video clip. But I'll tell you a little bit more as an introduction. So during World War II and for the many years after, Bob Hope lived to be 100 years old. He was a megastar. He started his career way back in the 1920s, singing and dancing and performing his comedy on vaudeville stages. So traveling from town to town and building up a reputation. And by World War II, he was beginning a very successful career. He had several film hits and a weekly radio show. So if you think of, a podcast today where someone's talking about the very most current events, that was what Bob did, but on the radio every week on NBC radio. And his show was called The Pepsodent Show. So it was also similar to nightly comedy shows like The Tonight Show, The Late Late Show. And during World War II, Bob connected with the troops like perhaps no other entertainer. He found during that time the audience that he loved performing for the most, the armed forces. And for the rest of his career, that wasn't something that he just did during World War II. For the rest of his career, he remained committed to entertaining and supporting the troops at home and all over the world, American troops. So you saw his first performance for the military audience was even before the US entered the war, and that was on May 6, 1941. And he really became addicted to that energy, right?
Right. Addicted to laughter.
Addicted to laughter. And so the connection, he served one of the most important functions I think that Bob Hope and his troupe performed was connecting with the troops, being there for them and letting them know that someone out there cared about them enough to come around the world and see them.
Yeah, he was kind of a bridge, I think, between the home front and the war front. And those kids had been used to seeing him, they'd gather around the radio. That was what people did in those days. And nobody had their own radios and cell phones and all of that. It was a family event, and they gathered around the radio and would listen to his show with their family. So when they saw him so far from home as they were, it made a connection, I think, that was really sort of indelible and something that they remembered, all their lives. And when they got back home, they used to send him letters and thank him and remind him of when they saw him and ask him for cheesecake recipes and, can you help me get a date with a big movie star at that time? Betty Grable was the big movie star.
So talking about letters and people writing Bob, that's one of the reasons we're here today, is to talk about our new exhibit and new show, Expressions of America. And the script of that show is drawn from letters from the wartime period. And Bob Hope received tremendous amounts of mail during the war. There's one estimate that is hard to believe that he received in 1944, he received 38,000 letters
Amazing.
a week.
And these were all handwritten letters, not typed on a computer, and not emails, and not texts. They were actually handwritten letters.
Right. So when you think about writing a letter to a celebrity, these were not just fan letters, saying, send me a photograph, a signed photograph or something like that. They were connecting to your dad in a really personal way, sometimes telling him their troubles and things like that. Why do you think what compelled people to write your dad at such a incredible volume? Why'd he get so much mail?
Well, I think people felt they knew him, and they were also used to writing letters, and letters themselves were so important, hearing from their loved ones, the soldiers' loved ones at home, family members. Sometimes even today they have school projects where kids can write in letters to servicemen that are serving. I'm sure that they had more of a habit of writing than maybe we do today. I don't know.
Right. So when we think about World War II, the time period, we've talked about radio a little bit. That was, the big medium where people found out about newspapers, of course, but then letters home, and letters to the soldiers on the fighting front. That was the main form of communication. People couldn't just Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, and they couldn't even email people. So writing an old-fashioned letter, taking a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, and writing out a message to that loved one was the main form of communication during World War II.
And sometimes, because even airmail, which was the fastest mail, took weeks and weeks for a letter to get into the hands of a loved one on either side of the ocean. And it was really kind of an interesting task. I mean, when you think about it, also because of the price of the weight of the letters, the paper usually had to be very, very thin, and it was something they called onion skin. And if you've ever peeled an onion, that's kind of the texture of the paper. And they would be restricted to small pieces of paper that folded over in certain ways, and you could seal them. But they were very, very thin. And in fact, sometimes Dad got some letters that were written on toilet paper.
Toilet paper.
Yes. Can you imagine? Yeah.
I think people would often have a hard time getting different kinds of paper to write on.
Yeah.
And so supply, of course, was a challenge. And so people wrote on what they had. But toilet paper, that also was pretty funny. Did that strike your dad as
Yeah, I think he got a big kick out of that one particularly. But you know, the thought of the mail and the weight of the letters and all of that, and that he got so many, it sometimes were just amazing. And my dad had a secretary that was, now they're called assistants, but then they were called secretary with great pride, and they went to school and they learned how to type, which you all probably learned when you were not even in school yet. And anyway, it was a very worthy profession. And this young woman graduated from secretarial school, and she went to work for my dad, and it was her first job. She was so organized. I tell you, I'm amazed at it. And she would go through the letters because there was such a volume of them, and he was away a lot. And she would pick out the ones that were especially needy of response, and then he would set aside some time and dictate to her. She would type on a typewriter the responses, and she made carbon copies. And carbon copies were something that people used all the time to duplicate. They couldn't press print and have get as many copies as you needed right away. It was just an interesting thing. Carbon paper, it was paper that was very thin, and it had carbon, some kind of carbon thing on it. And when you put it in with another piece of paper, you know, your original, and then the another piece of paper, the carbon went between, and when they typed, the letters from the typewriter would come out on the another piece of paper. So they had a record of those letters that my dad answered from the letters that were sent to him.
It's really amazing that a lot of the material that was sent to your dad, and even some of the material that he wrote, his responses to some of the servicemen and women, that it still survives.
Yeah.
So we're looking at 80 years later, nearly, we are able to still refer to and read and treasure some of the letters that were sent back and forth with your dad.
That is because of Miss Hughes, his secretary.
Yep. So
And
she started it, huh?
Yeah, she did. She was with him for 30 some odd years, I think.
Well, I look at her as sort of my forerunner here at the museum. She was sort of the curator or archivist before me. These letters passed through her hands, definitely. But I want to show, we actually have one here today to show you one of the copies that probably Miss Hughes herself wrote. And this is a reply.
Yeah, that's a carbon copy.
So we have a carbon copy here that was sent to James Ruffner in response to a letter that he wrote to your dad. And he writes, "Dear Jim, dropped by my home the other day to see if there was anything that needed to be taken care of before I left for overseas, and I found a stack of mail from you boys. Some of it rather ancient." So I love that he responds. You can see, I'm going to shift down a little bit. Sincerely, Bob Hope. Oh, I guess here down at the bottom, we see a little MH that I'm sure is Marjorie Hughes. So she made this typed response that was sent to James Ruffner. So that is just one example of a letter in the collection. A little bit later, I'll show you another letter, but I'd like to discuss with Linda, what are some of the types of things that people wrote your dad about? Did they write about his performance or?
No, sometimes they would mention the performance if they had actually seen him, but a lot of them had heard him on the radio because his radio show was sent overseas so that the servicemen could hear his weekly radio show. And also he did particular programs called command performances, where the soldiers could write in and ask for something, some particular celebrity that they liked. Could they appear on the radio show? And then the Army or whoever sponsored these programs made sure that that happened. And so they heard Dad a lot of times way before they ever saw him. And so they would lots of times reference his radio broadcasts and comment on that, and comment on the girls a lot. And tell some of the, it's amazing because they would share with him their everyday life, what they were doing when they were listening to his program, how they had to sometimes sneak away to hear the program at night because it was lights out or whatever they call it in the service. And so it was a lot of very personal stuff that they felt very free to share with him. And as I mentioned, a lot of them were requests to try and set up dates with different celebrities.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because I just have such a letter here that we can share with our audience. And you talked about command performance. So let's switch over. Here we are. You can see at the top here. Now, this type of letter in itself is very special because it's called V-mail. And V-mail was a particular type of stationery that was used to help save space. So Linda talked about how much mail there was and how it took up space in transport. So this was a type of mail that was then, you could fold it up into itself. So it was a letter and envelope in one, but then these letters were also photographed using a microfilm process. And then the reel of film was sent overseas. So there was an additional space-saving measure with this type of letter. But you can see at the top, this letter is to Bob Hope, care of Command Performance. And that was that call-in radio show that we talked about earlier.
The Armed Forces Radio Network provided that to the overseas guys.
And so they write, this is Private First Class Alex Stanridge writes, "Good morning, neighbors. Say, Bob, is the cute blonde, the Andrews sister, married, or is she available?" Available, Hope. So that must have been a common thing.
Yeah.
Matchmaker, right? So it's a really pleasant, jokey letter. In fact, he goes on to say, and sometimes this handwriting can be really difficult to read. So they're writing in script, in cursive. And he writes here, telling Bob a little bit, giving him a little glimpse about his experience. And he says, here, pardon the writing. So he recognizes at least that his handwriting is bad. Pardon the writing, but did you ever try to take a bath with your shoes on under a bed? You did? Well, now you know how I feel. So some of these letters were written under very trying circumstances. I doubt
they tried to make light of it and a joke so that it wasn't heavy and ponderous to send to a celebrity that they didn't really know, but they felt like they knew him. And since he had come over there, and whether they saw him or not, they knew that he was around in the area visiting troops. And a lot of them said, can you make a point to come to wherever it was that they were at the moment? But then they said, but you never know, we might not be here next time. And, that had several meanings. And it was touching.
So we have some letters, and I have one final letter I'd like to share with our students. We have a letter that was from someone who saw Bob in the summer of 1944. And the summer of 1944 was really special because that's when Bob Hope took his troop to the South Pacific. So they went to islands all around the Pacific, and some where fighting had just happened or where fighting was just about to occur. And they did a tremendous amount of traveling and tremendous number of shows within a very short period of time. Basically, during their summer break from the radio season, they went on a big, long entertainment tour of the battle sites of the Pacific, basically to visit American troops who had been there and who were very far away from home, often for the first time, and also probably pretty terrified.
I would think so.
So one letter that we have here, this final letter, it's from a sailor, Ralph Hauser, and he writes, "Dear folks, we just got back from seeing a traveling USO show, and it was really tops. Bob Hope, Francis Langford, Jerry Colonna, and some others were in it, and it was straight fun. No war bond sales or flag waving, just a laughing hour and a half. You've really got to give those people credit for doing a grand job. This was their 5th show today, and they seemed as fresh and happy as it was their first." How incredible. 5 shows in one day. And this is evidence. So this is from the collection of the National WWII Museum. And we have many of these letters from grateful Americans who saw your dad or who heard a radio performance from your dad in our collection. And I suspect these letters exist all over the United States.
Well, I think people might still have, the students might still have something up in an attic or locked away in a shoebox or something someplace that they've saved that was a kind of family treasure of a grandfather, or I guess that would be the age range at this time, most of or great-grandfather.
And letters are such an important source of information about the war. They can really tell you about someone's personal experience. We can tell a lot from those letters that we just looked at, just the stationery that they were written on, the style, whether or not they were printed or typed or handwritten. So there's a lot of information that you can gather just from analyzing that letter. So it looks like we have a lot of questions from our audience, and where shall we start? Okay, we have one from Dana, and that's, did your father ever bring you or your siblings on any tours with him?
Yes, actually, my brothers both went on tours uh, with him, and he put them to work, and they would help with the setup of the shows and all of that. But it wasn't the World War II experience. This was later on in Vietnam, and I produced the show that he did overseas during, this was his last one. He was actually 87 years old, and it was part of Operation Desert Storm, which was, the shows were in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the Middle East.
So you got to see firsthand what you got to witness, the
Yeah.
effect that your dad's comedy had on
Yeah,
people.
it was an amazing thing, and he got back so much from them. The sound of the laughter of all of those people gathered together, usually in an outside sort of venue, and it was stunning, and it revitalized him. I think that's the thing that gave him actually the energy to do 5 shows a day, or sometimes more than that. And I'm always so impressed when I see footage or I see something that shows the how the show was put together and all of that, and the fact that he kept doing it and doing it, and sometimes small shows for people. There's a story that actually there was a letter thanking him for doing a show, especially for this small platoon that had walked, I don't know, 4 or 5 miles to get to see the regular show, the big show, but somehow the timing was off and they missed it. And so my dad heard about that and grabbed a Jeep, and Francis Langford, the singer, and went after this small platoon and did a 30-minute show from the back of the Jeep for these guys. And they were thanking him for doing that. So, there were 5 shows, but then there were a lot of unscheduled performances. And then he spent time too visiting the hospitals. And his first line, he had the feeling that people didn't need to have pity, they didn't need quiet, they didn't need any kind of sympathy for their situation. So he used to walk into these wards that were kind of makeshift at best, the field hospitals, and he said, "All right, everybody up." And of course, they're there with the leg up in a cast and all of that, not able to move. And they all laughed, and they used to do things that were outrageous and everything to make them laugh and forget themselves for a few minutes. And when he would ask, like Francis Langford, the singer, who was a popular singer of the day, and she would sing a song that they may have sung to their sweetheart or heard with their sweethearts, and she would say sometimes that she was so affected by the whole situation that all she wanted to do was break down. And he had warned them ahead of time, don't cry, don't put on a sad face or anything like that. That's not what these guys need. They need you to, for that minute or two in time, you're their girlfriend or their wife, and that's what you have to be for them. So the letters that we got back, or Dad got back, thanking him for those kind of precious moments, reflected some of his feelings about performing for these people that were in the hospitals.
Yeah, that's a very hard thing to do,
Yeah.
to really put yourself aside and your own emotions,
Right.
and really just be there for someone else. And your dad was there
Yeah.
for a great number of people. It's estimated that in his lifetime he performed for more than 11 million troops, which is just
A lot of people.
yeah, a lot of people. And you kind of touched on this in the last question, in the last answer, but we have a question from Melanie. How did your dad handle knowing that so many young soldiers who wrote to him may not have survived
Yeah.
the war?
Well, he tried to give them the best shows possible, and as if it would be their last show. He never knew, but he wanted to give them the best of himself, and that's what he did. And I think that's kind of a little lesson for all of us to, you know, do our best by people that we reach out to, and you never know what life is going to bring.
Yeah. I think of your dad sometimes as, a living letter to the troops.
Yeah.
He mailed himself overseas and showed up, and he gave a message to his audiences that he was there for them. He was supporting them, and that they weren't forgotten, even though they probably felt forgotten a lot,
Yeah.
being so far from home and in that dangerous situation. Miss Williams' class ask of you, have you received letters from people who saw your dad?
I have, and it's very heartwarming, and usually it's a thank you and an appreciation for what Dad did. And oftentimes when these letters came in more in the Vietnam era, and after that, the other conflicts and wars that we were involved with, and that Dad entertained the troops, they would ask if there was any video footage that sometimes it would be the last time that maybe their son or husband would be spotted in the audience. And so that was always very touching. And we tried as much as possible to find that footage and give them some kinds of tape or something they could have.
Yeah, that would be an interesting assignment, perhaps. There are a large number of Vietnam veterans who are still walking among us that we can talk to, and many, we have several volunteers here at the museum who are Vietnam veterans who had seen your dad perform in Vietnam. And that could be, if any of you know a Vietnam veteran in your life, your grandfather perhaps, that that would be an interesting question to see if they had ever witnessed a Bob Hope show. So we have a question from Jay, who asks, are these letters available to view at the museum? And I'll say yes, many of them are available for viewing on our website. So we have articles that reference these letters, and they can be seen. There are scans of the letters that are available on the website. Some of the letters to Bob Hope are in the collection at the Library of Congress. So if you, I actually had the opportunity to go to the Library of Congress, which is an amazing place, and to see some of the letters there. And then I'll say that many of the letters are included in this book that's called Dear Bob. There are, I think, hundreds of letters from GIs during World War II. So there are some good sources out there, and some places that you can read some of this amazing material. We have a couple more here. This, I think, one is difficult to answer, but we'll take a stab at it. This is from David. Approximately how many replies did Bob send back during World War II?
Oh, gosh, I really wouldn't hazard a
I
guess.
know.
I mean, he traveled a lot doing his weekly radio show from a different army base or camp or something, hospital, throughout the war years. So he wasn't home a whole lot. And then he did these bigger tours, overseas. And so in between, somehow he was able to answer. And I'd say there were thousands that he answered, but I couldn't say exactly how many.
Yeah. Well, we know from that one letter that he says when he returned home, there was this pile of mail, stack of mail from you boys, and some of it was rather ancient. So
Yeah.
even if he answered a letter that months later, that was
Yeah, exactly. He did it. And then the letter, once those people had moved on to another location, because in the war they moved, they didn't just stay in one place the whole time unless they were assigned to a hospital or something like that. But when they would move, it would take them even that much longer to find them. And so sometimes it was a year later.
yeah, it's like having a really long, drawn out conversation. You write something, a question maybe, and it takes 6 months to get a response.
Yeah.
But so that's, well, we've talked a lot about sort of sad letters and loneliness and being away from home, but let's talk a little bit about comedy and about laughter. I think there's a lot of interest in this chat, and just in general in some of your dad's jokes. And we have some letters. I've seen letters where people try out, and even the one letter that we read, people try out material on your dad or send it to him. And I read there was one about a German foxhole, and they knew it was a German foxhole because the fox sneezed and said, someone said, the fox said Gesundheit. There was that was, I am a terrible joke teller. No, bad. But so did your dad ever tell you the jokes before he went to perform? This is from Ms. Moncada's class.
Yeah, actually he did. In fact, before his radio shows, he would try out his material at home at dinner. And so we were the guinea pigs, so to speak, and we would hear the jokes. And my mother, we didn't really, as kids, have too much input, I don't think, of a serious nature about the quality of his jokes. But I remember my mother really would have her word about, if something seemed to be too off color or inappropriate in some way, she would let him know. And most of the time he paid attention to her.
Was it like a thumbs up or a thumbs down?
Essentially, that was it.
How funny, a comedy show every night at dinner, or
No, that was the fun thing. And when we got to be a little bit older and could read and all of that, we got to cue him on his lines, if he was making a film. And he would have to study his lines the night before. And one or another of us, there were two during the war years and all of that, and then later on, about 8 years later, my younger brother and sister came along. But the older ones got to participate a little bit.
So we have a question from Julie that I think is important for us to cover here in this format. Julie asks, was the troop ever in danger while traveling to various shows?
Yeah, they actually were very often in dangerous situations. And there was a danger actually flying in these little planes that were, I'm not sure exactly. Well, the Wright brothers started out when the year my dad was born, 1903, was, I think, their first flight. And so you could see by 1944 and the war years, air traffic and air flight was not very sophisticated at all, and they were all propeller driven planes, and cold, and no temperature control, and they had, when they were lucky, box lunches with the sandwich that was usually stale and maybe a pickle, I don't know. And it was not fun stuff. And this intrepid little group would go. So there was a hazard and a risk just making the flights to get over there. And then once there, they were very often close to danger, and had several close calls. I'm sure kept my mother awake a lot, worrying about them.
Yeah, well, they had one sort of famous water landing and a
Yeah,
crash landing,
in
right?
Australia.
In
Yeah.
Australia, when they
Yeah.
were going over to perform.
Yeah,
And then also several instances where they had to share foxholes with
Yeah.
some of the troops because they were close to artillery fire, and were subject to air raids and other things that
yeah, very often they had to get quickly into foxholes.
yeah, so they were very close to the action in a number of cases. But like Linda said, yes, the getting to the actual
Yeah.
performance was often in itself very dangerous.
And they often had mechanical difficulties, and would have to stay longer in a place while they tried to fix whatever the problem was. But
Yeah. And
he was
still
very
did
lucky.
it.
Yeah.
He did it for many, many years after. So his last performances, he was in his 80s,
Yeah,
right?
late 80s.
Mhm. And that was in
Well, it was
Saudi
Saudi
Arabia.
Arabia and Bahrain. It was Operation Desert Storm, they called it.
Mhm.
And it was very brief. Only, I think, it only lasted a few weeks.
Wow.
Yeah.
You see, the brief tours only last a few weeks. I
Yeah.
thought you were a few
Yeah.
weeks is
Yeah.
a long time for someone, especially
Well, to be away, and the culture was different, and having
Yeah.
to get used to all of that. It was very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, well, if there are, I think we've covered a lot of ground with our questions, and we want to thank you for joining us. We do have another little glimpse at Bob Hope to share with you that we'll go ahead and do now.
From Pearl Harbor to the beaches of Normandy, from victory in Europe to the mushroom clouds looming large over Japan, America's fighting men and women were thrilled and honored that Bob Hope was there for them. And they, in turn, became important to him. He would carry the memories and the patriotic glow from World War II with him for the rest of his life.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bob Hope. Well, this is it. That day we've been waiting for, that day we've been praying for. This day means so many different things to so many different people. To the men who made this day possible, we know that it means the beginning of life again. It means home. Thanks to their sacrifices, we still have homes. Thanks to their sacrifices, there's one place left where you can still walk down a street and find all the buildings still in one piece. That was their promise to humanity, the sacrifice, and the world knows how completely they've kept their promise.
We've been headed for this day for 3.5 years of war. 3.5 years is a long time. For many Americans, it'll be forever. A terrible menace to civilization has been erased. Congratulations, men.
You boys that live here, baby. You boys who set the pace. Cause you're the guys who are gonna go into pure space. So